Recorded. Bryan, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm hearing a little feedback. You guys hear me okay? Okay, I think someone just muted. Okay, good. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about a story. It's a personal story in many ways, but I think it helps illustrate what we're here to talk about. I was asked to speak about sort of the history of how we got here with racial inequity in housing, and that this history may be helpful to us as part of the Realtors in figuring out where we go next. First, let me say that I was honored on the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act to be invited to speak to the Chicago Association of Realtors. At the time, I was working at HUD, where I oversaw HUD's Office of Fair Housing. And I was really honored because on that occasion, the Chicago Association of Realtors was apologizing for its role in housing discrimination historically and producing segregated neighborhoods. And I was just really, really moved. And it was a very big story locally that the Chicago Association of Realtors had apologized. And as you all know, the National Association of Realtors is based in Chicago as well. And so it had a lot of resonance. I'm not sure how many local associations have apologized for its role in promoting segregation, but for it to come out of Chicago was really moving. And I didn't know then, because I was working at HUD at the time, that I would come work for the National Association of Realtors. And I have to say that was a decisive reason that I had that experience and saw what the Realtors were doing and their commitment to this issue. So I thought I'd actually talk to you in terms of the history by sharing some of what I said there and helping connect it to my own history. So my children who are here, their great-grandfather lived in Chicago for a period. And let me tell you a little bit about him. So Hilding Wanblum arrived in Chicago in the spring of 1927. He probably arrived at Union Station, and from there he made his way to 7314 South Kenwood Avenue in the greater Grand Crossing neighborhood of Chicago. This is where friends in the United States had arranged lodging for him, among other Swedish immigrants. When he wasn't working at the nuts and bolts factory, Hilding went out dancing, went to the movies. He even took in the Jack Dempsey-Gene Tunney fight at Soldiers Field that September. Hilding was a young man. He had lots of things on his mind. So he may not have noticed that the Chicago Real Estate Board was fanning out about the South Side and sending his landlord notices with the good news. What's the good news? Well, the previous year, the Supreme Court had effectively signaled that American homeowners could keep Blacks out of their neighborhoods through the use of racially restrictive covenants. Chicago Real Estate Board wasted no time telling Chicago homeowners that this was the legal way they could confine African Americans to the Black Belt of Chicago. They had tried violence. Nancy Denton and Douglas Massey, in their book, American Apartheid, report that in a 45-month period between 1917 and 1921, there were 58 firebombings of Black homes in white areas. This was Chicago's response to the Great Migration, which saw 50,000 African Americans arrive from the South to Chicago in just 1 year, and 500,000 from 1916 to 1970. So the good news was they could use covenants, and covenants were civilized. A contract, a gentleman's agreement. Al Capone's mother, who also lived in Grand Crossing, got herself a covenant for the family home. We're respectable people, she must have thought, and covenants were on the up and up. Within a year, according to the Hyde Park Herald, covenants stretched, quote, like a marvelously delicately woven chain of armor from the northern gates of Hyde Park to Woodlawn, Park Manor, South Shore, Windsor Park, and all the far-flung white communities of the South Side. And for 2 decades, 90% of South Side's communities remained overwhelmingly white. Now, Hilding didn't stick around long enough to see that. In 1933, Hilding returned to Sweden to marry the farm girl he had left behind. Had Hilding remained in the United States, he would have discovered he was just the kind of newly arrived immigrant America wanted in its residential neighborhoods. That very year, America was developing a racial hierarchy for real estate. Had Hilding stayed, he would have learned that Scandinavians were at the top of the list, along with the English, Germans, Scotch, and Irish. If Hilding had visited one of the Swedish coffee houses on the South Side, one of those places that added a little something extra in your coffee during the Prohibition period, he would have encountered Homer Hoyt, the University of Chicago economist who came up with the racial hierarchy for real estate. Hoyt argued in his PhD thesis that the presence of certain populations in a community were beneficial to house values, while the presence of others, like African Americans, was detrimental. There was a whole ranking of the white ethnic groups in between the top tier and the lowest tier. This fellow Hoyt would go on to work as an economist for the Federal Housing Administration, and the federal agency adopted this hierarchy as government policy in 1934. And appraisers, even despite changes in law, followed these practices for nearly 35 years. We know the consequences. The New Deal helped underwrite homeownership for millions of Americans in some communities and in new affordable subdivisions throughout America, provided they didn't sell homes to African Americans and sometimes other racial minorities. I know my own grandfather's experience, my children's other great-grandfather, when he moved to New York in the 1940s. He eventually settled in Queens, in one of the few communities where African Americans could buy. His son, some years later, my father, a year before the passage of the Fair Housing Act, moved to Queens as well from the South. And he moved into a neighborhood called St. Albans, which also was one of the few neighborhoods then, and for a period, where African Americans could buy. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, people like Count Basie, Lena Horne, John Coltrane, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Jackie Robinson, some of the wealthiest African Americans in American history to that point, could only buy in that area. If they wanted a house, somewhere they could park a big car, that was the only place they could buy in Queens. James Brown later bought a home in that area. In fact, 1968, when he wrote "Say It Loud, I'm Black and Proud," he wrote it from a home in that community. And that's also where I grew up. And in the time that I lived there, there was a sharp dividing line where African Americans lived in single family, detached homes with front yards, backyards, and where whites and others lived. And that line is still pretty much observed today. But when my grandfather moved to Queens He could not move into the new affordable subdivisions like Levittown that were being developed all over the country. And my father, at the time that he moved to Queens, could not buy in that subdivision. And if New York Newsday's recent investigation of discrimination on Long Island is any indication, many of those communities may still be closed to me or to many Black families today through subterfuge. And today, fewer than 1% of Levittown residents are African American. Also today, those homes that were closed to others, including GIs, they own the government program for veterans, which did not fully deliver for African American veterans. Those homes that white GIs were able to purchase are worth 70 times what people paid for them in the 1950s. And even adjusting for inflation, that's still near 7 times their original value. So the government in the 1930s invested in what became intergenerational wealth accumulation for some, while it locked others out of these neighborhoods and these ultimate opportunities. What's more, it locked minorities into other communities, sometimes across highways, railroad tracks, and other geographical barriers, where it discouraged housing investment in those communities through redlining, and it also discouraged investment of other kinds. And this contributed greatly to the social inequality we see today. So Hilding, had he stayed, missed an opportunity. So, of course, from the beginning, there were people who fought these policies and practices. In communities nationwide, people challenged the racial covenants that government policies encouraged. From New York to Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, they challenged them. Carl Hansberry, the father of writer Lorraine Hansberry, advanced the law with a case that went to the Supreme Court, challenging a racial covenant in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago. And while that case established important legal principles that are still enforced today, that case didn't actually invalidate racially restrictive covenants. It was a 1948 St. Louis case called Shelley v. Kramer that did. And that case was brought by none other than Thurgood Marshall, who you all know, but also a man named Lorin Miller, who you may not know. He was co-counsel. And he's an unsung hero of the civil rights movement and fair housing in particular. Miller was the owner of the California Eagle, an influential Black newspaper in Los Angeles, much like the better known Chicago Defender. Obviously, he was also a lawyer, and he brought hundreds of cases in Los Angeles challenging covenants. Miller brought these cases on behalf of low-income clients, but also on behalf of Hollywood stars like Hattie McDaniel, Ethel Waters, and others. And speaking in the 1940s, Miller was prescient in expressing the explosive role of housing segregation and the explosive role that it would play in American life. He argued that covenants and other practices to maintain segregation don't preserve public peace or promote the general welfare, as their proponent said. Instead, he said, they resulted in, quote, nothing but bitterness and strife. And that came to a boiling point in the 1960s. It was my great honor to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act in Chicago, because Chicago is indisputably the birthplace of the Fair Housing Act, which was truly groundbreaking. The law spent years, you could say, in utero in the streets of Chicago during the Chicago Freedom Movement of the late 60s. Dr. King came to Chicago to help birth this movement and the Fair Housing Act. And Dr. King, many don't realize, actually took up residence in the North Lawndale section of Chicago. This is the area of Chicago which now has the highest rate of violence in the United States. This is the area that people are always pointing to when they say, well, what about black on black crime? Sort of often implying it's the fault of those people living in that neighborhood. So Dr. King came up and stayed in North Lawndale for a year. And this really was the catalyst for the Fair Housing Act, and the work that he did with tens of thousands of Chicago residents who were demanding for a change, who were the real force behind this law. By that time, we had seen what 5 decades of government policy and discriminatory private practices and violence had done to the city. Douglas Massey, the Princeton professor, then was, when he was a University of Chicago professor, described this phenomenon of our history, this way of life, as American apartheid. And that's no exaggeration. And it was like 2 separate cities, Chicago was, when Dr. King arrived in 1966. And Dr. King said it was also like 2 different economies at work. The main economy and what he called the slum economy, with slum housing, slum schools, and slum jobs, his words. His goal was to eliminate the slum economy root and branch. In the end, he decided it was housing segregation that was at the heart of it, and he needed to drive a stake through it. But easier said than done. I think this challenge was well told in the play The Great Society, a Broadway play, which was the sequel to another play you may have heard of called All the Way, with the Breaking Bad star Bryan Cranston as LBJ. The resistance that King faced in Chicago was more violent than anything he'd encountered in the South. In the end, to get the protests to stop, Mayor Daley offered to sign a summit agreement with King with pledges to stop discriminatory real estate practices. And this scene in this play depicts a conversation between King and fellow civil rights leader James Bevel and Ralph Abernathy. I'll just share a little bit of that since I'm on stage here. James Bevel says, "There's nothing binding here, Doc. No real goals, no timetable, no enforcement penalties. It's just a lot of vague promises to do better." Ralph Abernathy says, "It's the best we could get." James Bevel, "It's meaningless." MLK, "We lost James, and it wasn't just Daley. The people of Chicago don't want integration any more than Selma does." James Bevel, "What do we do then?" MLK, "I have no effing idea." So here we are, 50 years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act, passed by Congress only after the assassination of Dr. King and after civil unrest throughout the nation. That period of bitterness and strife that Lauren Miller talked about, Lauren Miller, the civil rights lawyer, that period that he prophesied in the 1940s seems to recur. No doubt this year we're seeing bitterness and strife. So if King had no idea what to do after the Chicago Freedom Movement, you can imagine how many others have struggled since then. And the Chicago we talk about proliferated a really nefarious practice, which still many people don't appreciate, called contracts for deed. That's destroyed many, many neighborhoods. This is the practice where you are told you're buying a house, but you're really just signing a contract that you'll get the deed when you pay all of these installment periods, but where you get evicted from the house if you miss one. Essentially renting with a elusive promise to ultimately own the house. And this destroyed whole neighborhoods, destroyed the finances, exploited the finances of untold tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of African Americans, and destroyed many of those neighborhoods. And that's what you're seeing. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the author, the MacArthur Genius Award winner, and I think maybe won a Pulitzer Prize too, tells us well in his article from the Atlantic called "The Case for Reparations," and explains how this extracted wealth from tens of thousands. And this is just not in Chicago, but it's in Detroit. It's in cities nationwide. What you are seeing in terms of blight are people who had opportunities to own homes, but were taken advantage of for generations, for decades, for scores of decades, generations. And so these are the challenges as we talk about home ownership and closing the wealth gap. We've got about a century, post-slavery, where people had on paper opportunities to live in communities, but were exploited and had these opportunities taken away and forever dangled and elusive. And that's the challenge we still face 52 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So we as realtors, as we consider policy, as we consider how we can lead, there's more for us to do than what we are endeavoring to do to make sure there's no discrimination in our real estate practices. We need to lean in on policy as well. I have spoken a lot about this ACT plan that I created when I joined the Realtors to address the kinds of practices you see in the New York Newsday video. And we are doing all kinds of things to ensure accountability, culture change, and training. That's what ACT stands for. It's an acronym. When it comes to the housing transaction and the laws that govern that. But I've also said we need a second act. And I think it's become more urgent as Americans witness just what segregation has wrought in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's killings, that we need to lean in heavily on policy and address these issues, which, sure, the government caused, but where we from the very beginning have had a role. So this is true everywhere in the United States. It's true in Tacoma, as you know. And as we think about where we can make our influence felt as government policy people, we need to keep this history in mind. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'd happily take questions.
Hi.
Oh, there we go.
Hi, Bryan.
Hey, Jasmine.
Feels like you're becoming a Washingtonian with as much as you're here with us.
That's what my driver's license says.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I wanted to kind of add to what you were talking about with the history element. There's a really great book called The Warmth of Other Suns that discusses that migration. And I have relatives that started in Virginia and Alabama and ended up in Chicago during that time. So it's interesting hearing you talk about that from that perspective. And I think that anybody who's interested more in that, that's a good book to read.
Yes, thanks for mentioning that book. It was in the news again recently. There was an interesting story about Dr. King's visit to India. I think Isabel Wilkerson may tell the story. For some reason, I'm connecting her to this. And how he was, he had dined with the prime minister, and he'd been, taken all over the country, and he eventually went to a school in a region of the untouchables, the untouchable caste. And the teacher who introduced him to the class described him as a fellow untouchable from America. And King was really offended, and he was like, calling me an untouchable. And it wasn't really until then, being there, that he recognized that America had a caste system. And that's, it seems obvious now, but that's what, he was enduring and what he was fighting against. And so he actually, then embraced that, yes, he was an untouchable in America. And so I do believe it's helpful that Americans are thinking more about these issues and actually squarely recognizing that despite our promises and our commitment, that we've really created, over, a century or more, a system that still in many ways works against people, and that you have to recognize it and have to fight against that in order to make enduring progress. So we're making lots of gains, but we really have to recognize how everything operates based on some of the decisions we made many, many decades ago.
So I do actually have a question. So while we are learning this history and kind of making our own personal reckonings with it, and we are in these leadership positions and we have this voice, platform, and power to influence policy, what are some of the prominent or primary policy changes that we as realtors could be making right now? What's good use of our energy with this?
Yeah, well, I think a few. One, as you know, the National Association of Realtors, and specifically the Fair Housing Policy Committee, comments on legislative and regulatory policy. And so this year we've commented on two important HUD regs, which will continue to make a difference in housing. One is the disparate impact regulation, and one is the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation. I don't know whether I want to, if people really want to hear, more detail about them, I'm happy to go into them. But they're two different regulations, but significant. The first, disparate impact, really deals with how you prove discrimination and stresses that discrimination does not require always that you prove that someone intended to do it. It doesn't mean it was unintentional. It means you don't have to prove the intent, meaning if a policy clearly acts to exclude people, and if the person implementing the policy cannot defend why they have it, can't explain why it's even necessary, but just wants to persist in it, then it can violate the law. And we expressed our concern that the Trump administration had reversed really the standards and said that the person bringing the case has to put themselves in the room where the policy was created and prove that it was intended to discriminate. So no one can prove that, a policy that cuts a certain way, actually, they can't really present a smoking gun. But if people cannot defend why they have it, the courts have long said, and the Supreme Court as recently as 2015 said, that's discrimination. And so we're concerned because this regulation doesn't honor what the Supreme Court said in 2015. And we've said we have concerns with it. And then more recently, we said, along with Bank of America, Wells Fargo, the Mortgage Bankers Association, and others, that we just don't need this now. That we, as the industry, need to do the reflection and examine whether policies that are having bad effects are truly necessary for our business, and that we will do that work, and that the proposed HUD reg reverses. And likewise, on affirmatively furthering, I won't say a whole lot, just that that is the law from 1968, the Fair Housing Act, that has a provision that says communities have a responsibility to undo this legacy of segregation that I described. It's not about the suburbs, as the president's been tweeting. It's not about low-income housing. It is about recipients of community development block grants. If Tacoma gets a grant, that it makes sure that in Tacoma, it is doing what it can to address legacies of segregation. So you have identifiable neighborhoods like Hilltop and other places, and you need to investigate, well, why do we still have it? It doesn't prescribe what the solutions are, but it says if you're going to get our taxpayer dollars, you need to spend some time making sure that anyone who can afford to live in other neighborhoods is not facing barriers that are unnecessary, and it's government policy reinforcing those barriers. So we've opined on that one and said, it's important. The Trump administration has said, we're not going to enforce that. Communities, just tell us that you are furthering fair housing and you will get your money. And that's the first time in 50 years that we've said there's no standard for communities to get that money. So that's another one where we've commented. So that's on the national scale. Locally, there's, I think, a lot you can do. I mean, one, look at the segregation and figure out, what is going on. Local zoning, not suburban zoning, but local zoning, even within Tacoma, could also be an issue in driving ongoing segregation. But there could be other things, geographical boundaries, other, barriers that prevent people from living in different communities. Or even the fact that you might have a civil rights commission that is poorly funded and not actually doing much. I don't know if that's the case, but I'm just saying there are all kinds of local decisions that realtors can support and lean in on. Okay.
So Brian, would you say that in the current situation that we're in with discrimination, is it more about policy or practices?
That's a great question. I have to say it's still more about policy, but in a way that I kind of think our behavior is guided in ways we may not fully appreciate. I think it was some of the folks out in Tacoma, who told me about Nate Bowling and some of the work that he's done, especially around education. And so just take, for example, the fact that we've generally advised real estate agents not to talk about schools. And I think that's probably wise on some level. Real estate agents don't know much about schools in particular, accurate information about schools. But we also tell them, like, hey, refer people to third-party sources on schools, on crime, et cetera. And a lot of those third-party sources on schools just really reinforce existing segregation. So they often don't provide a very nuanced portrait of the teaching of schools. Most of them don't talk about equality teaching. They don't know how to quantify the teaching. They talk about test scores, which anywhere in America, regardless of race, test scores tend to skew based on the affluence of a community. So if you're in South Dakota and you want to look at test scores of schools, it corresponds with the affluence, not, you might be in a all homogenous racial community. And so you're not really telling people a whole lot about schools when you just provide that information. There's much more that goes into schools, but often that correlates with racial segregation in many communities too. And so when people say this is a good school district, this is a bad school district, they're often mixing, the racial demography in with that. And so that's an example of where people may not be, may not have bad intentions, but the way things are set up end up perpetuating people's decisions. And it's like that with so many other things too. So even, well-intentioned folks sometimes end up just rehearsing some of the same patterns. Other questions? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, I'm Morgan
Hi.
Reed. Have you seen any other realtor associations like recently make steps? Are you seeing any results, I guess is what I'm asking, of what other associations are doing to eliminate trying to be anti-racist within our community of realtors?
Yeah.
Have you seen any results?
What
do we need to do?
I can't say I've seen results per se. I've seen commitment. So I mentioned Chicago, obviously. What's really impressive about Chicago is just how incredibly diverse that association is. At the event that I spoke at, the president was Korean American. There was just, Latinos, African Americans, all in their leadership. It was just very, very diverse, majority women as well. And they just have it going on and have been at it. And that apology was not just an apology. I remember the Korean American president apologizing to, not just the people present, but apologizing to the ancestors. It was like really deep. there are other communities who are trying to do different things too. I heard from some people in Durham who are looking to come up with strategies that are restorative. So, in a lot of the discussions about boosting minority home ownership and closing the wealth gap, you know, the discussion's often, how do we get people mortgage ready? How do we, you know, educate and provide housing counseling? All of those things are very important because a lot of people don't have that background. But it kind of suggests the deficiency just rests with this population and doesn't acknowledge just what we did and why they're so far behind and what they had. I mean, even just thinking about 2008, you know, so much wealth was lost with predatory lending, you know, predatory subprime lending and the recession that caused. And we're finding that a lot of the recent wealth gap and a lot of the loss is because a whole nother generation were preyed upon. And I can tell you, you know, where my parents live in New York and Queens, middle class African American neighborhood, single family homes, people own their homes for 40 years. Those were the neighborhoods targeted. I saw the flyers, saw all of it. And my parents were pretty savvy, but I had to keep telling them, do not answer any of these calls. You own your home free and clear. You don't need any money. They had lots of money. They're great savers. But you know, these were communities that were attacked. And so a lot of the, there are some associations who are saying we need to do more than just, you know, get people to, you know, get ready to purchase a mortgage. We should be thinking about down payment assistance. We should be thinking, are there ways we can invest in communities that were harmed? I know that Asheville, I don't know to what extent the realtors are involved in it. Asheville, North Carolina is actually talking about some kind of restoration for how urban renewal displaced African Americans, you know, just 40 years ago, and how people lost. So there are a lot of things that people can look at, I think, that can be restorative. Another thing, you can maybe do this in Tacoma too, is look at what's going on with appraisals. Andre Perry of the Brookings Institute just put out a book just about how even when you control for things like crime and neighborhood amenities, homes occupied by and in neighborhoods with significant African American populations are valued less. So it could be a home, you know, an area with 10% African American population, or whatever. That when you look at the comps, they're bizarre, and you know, he can explain it better than I can. But all of the other things like demand and neighborhood amenities, et cetera, they control for, and they still find. He said that there was a 25% decrease at what those homes were valued for. So appraisers are part of our association. So those are some things we can lean in on and do more studies to sort of figure out what's going on there. I mean, appraisers just say, we don't look at race, but something funny is happening.
All right. Anybody else with any other questions for Bryan? Marty, you're muted.
I had it unmuted now and it popped back on again. All right. Anyway, the question I've got is, can you think of any specific examples from the lending perspective where it seems as though discrimination or, you know, disfavor is being looked upon? And the reason I say that is from the perspective of an educator. There were many, many significant changes that took place after 2007, 2010, especially in 2015 with the changes that took place in disclosure and so forth. But from a lender's perspective, as well as an educator, every year, federal law, when it comes to fair lending, fair housing, things of that nature, are mandated. And we go over that stuff over and over and over again. And so, you know, I guess speaking to as many as 1,100 students a year, I'm not seeing that much of an impact. But do you see examples of that are taking place? Because from our perspective, if a person meets the qualification and they have the capacity to repay and the collateral is sufficient enough to be able to justify the loan, we don't stand in the way. We push to make those things happen. We don't make money unless we're making successful deals. And we don't look at, you know, we're colorblind for the most part.
Yeah. So You know, certainly there's been a lot of funky stuff with lending and where, you know, overrides that are permitted and the retrenchment on credit following the recession. You know, I think it's another place where there needs to be sort of national efforts at making sure underwriting criteria are truly predictive and are capturing the credit worthiness of everybody. I really think for the most part, most lending is being driven by what Fannie and Freddie do, and likewise FHA. And so that's where I think that's where the dance is, to figure out whether the underwriting components are truly predictive. And that's where we, as the National Association of Realtors, want to do more to explore how alternative credit can better reflect credit worthiness. So there is work to do there. I think most of that is national. One thing that I have heard and people have suggested is that, you know, when you see things like in New York Newsday where an agent requires a pre-approval letter from minorities and doesn't from whites, which, you know, could be discouraging people from, you know, getting in the car or, you know, and seeing a place when, you know, someone else might have that opportunity. Some of that are, I think, real estate agents reacting to discrimination that they've seen in lending, or if not discrimination, inequities, that there's a perception that minorities may not be ready to buy. And so where they may take a white person and start to show them houses without asking, can you get a loan? They don't spend the time with some of the minority persons, maybe even unconsciously, because they're thinking, I may be wasting my time. We're going to get farther along. And because the world is the world, they may not get a loan. And I've got to spend time on people who are ready. So I think there are some downwind or downstream effects of the fact that, you know, there are still very high rejection rates for minorities in the lending space. So, but I think the changes that need to happen nationally and with Fannie and Freddie, and you know, so that's my thought on that.
Have you seen the new criteria that comes into play when it comes down to HMDA on the existing applications with the changes and how it breaks down the racial and the physiological background and so forth?
No. Are there new categories that people answer?
Well, I mean, now it gets very detailed when it comes to ethnic and physical background. The only thing that they do not portray is, you know, any other genders. Right now, it's still strictly male or female, and I think that's identified because of the government issued identification that they receive.
Right.
But when it comes down to it, if, for example, the question, are you African American or are you Black?
Mm-hmm.
Having a distinction. And then if it's African American, is there a background or a generational history when it comes to either Africa or nationality? Same thing when it comes down to Hispanics. Are you from Mexico? Are you from another country? And actually identify specific countries.
Yeah. I have to look at that because I thought it still followed the census descriptions, which usually have all of those places in parentheses. But if they're making a distinction, I mean, I know I've worked, you know, in government, or I did work in government for, you know, 20 plus years, and was at the table for some of the discussions over census in 2000 and later years when you could sort of self-identify. And there was a concern among government folks that, you know, that self-identification isn't necessarily the same as how other people see you and might treat you. And so there's, I think, sometimes a desire to gather the information like, okay, but will other people think you're from Africa? And so that they can code it and, you know, have data they can bridge from one census to the next. I'm not aware of that specifically with HMDA, but I'll take a look and see what I think.
I'd be more than willing to go ahead and share the information. I can send you a copy of a blank 1003 application, because that gets into a lot of the detail and so forth, and it still asks specific questions. Are you or are you not a citizen? Are you a resident or a non-resident? because we
Yeah.
do have specific programs. We have lenders that will loan to folks that are not US citizens and have an ITIN number versus the social security number. So, I mean, there's many opportunities. And when it comes
Yeah.
down to identifying different categories, we have so many different programs available with the down payment assistance and other activities that are available.
Yeah, I mean, historically, the law has said you cannot, make any of these decisions, even affirmative decisions, based on race and lending. So, provided it's not, giving any group a leg up, HMDA data is just collected for recording purposes, so that when we evaluate or government evaluates lending, they can look at the record of a particular entity. So.
I have another question.
Hey.
Are there any examples of cities that have either have a plan or are working on preventing displacement while reconstructing certain areas? So for instance, the Hilltop is having a growth and there's people getting displaced there. And the conversation is, how do we prevent the displacement when you have investors and developers and all this other stuff and it becomes really expensive? So is anybody getting close to kind of cracking that code?
I don't know. I know that places like this Washington has always tried to find ways to do what they call inclusionary zoning. So to require in certain communities or require in certain deals that there be housing at more affordable rates, not necessarily government assisted, but
Right. We have some of that built into things that like the city of Tacoma are doing, but I think what we identified were the numbers weren't adequate enough to not displace people, and it was so finite that you get 1 or 2 people in a development.
Right, and then sometimes these plans allow developers to sell that right or requirement, to someone else and get out of it. So I hear about those efforts, but not so much else in terms of how to balance gentrification. It's funny because this is exactly what the HUD affirmatively furthering fair housing effort wanted to examine, whether or not communities were looking at these questions and trying to find solutions. And I know when that effort started in like 2016 or so, there were cities like New Orleans and others that were looking forward to doing this. Louisville, Kentucky. I just don't know whether they followed through. And now I don't think that data is available because they're not really required to do anything other than say, yes, we affirmatively further fair housing. But I do know that there are urban planners who've been talking about these things for a while and trying to work them in. I just don't know, who's been successful.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Bryan, thank you very much for the presentation on the history of discrimination, where we are today and where we need to go in the future on this issue. So your expertise is greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
All right.